Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the 2020 Petroleum Economists LNG-to-power Forum for Europe, the Middle East and Africa. We're going to turn now to innovations in gas, and it's made me look back over 3 decades, back to the late 80s, 90s, when natural gas was really only starting to be used on a large scale as a fuel for gas to power, notably with the dash for gas here in the UK. Now, over those 3 decades, we've seen a lot of innovation. One crucial innovation as a market enabler was the floating storage and regasification unit, and that technology continues to develop with various configurations of regasification and storage, and we'll be discussing some of that in this panel. We also have the whole issue of smaller markets being opened and how you do that. We've had Gibraltar coming in as a very small market. We've had Malta, we've had Jamaica. So how do you manage these very small markets? We did have mentions earlier of ISO containers, and that's another interesting innovation. The decarbonisation theme is a big one and becoming bigger all the time, although I have to say that there's a lot of hype here as well, because at least for the next 5 to 10 years, and this was mentioned in the previous session, the replacement of coal with natural gas, whether it's been decarbonised or not, is one of the lowest hanging fruits for decarbonisation of those economies still heavily dependent on coal. And even some European countries, like, for example, Germany, still have plenty of scope to do coal to gas switching, even if gas hasn't been decarbonised. But there is nevertheless a trend towards decarbonising even LNG. And for example, in Qatar, I've noticed that Saad Al-Kaabi has been saying that feed gas for the expansion of the North Field projects will actually be will have its CO2 extracted with carbon capture. So an important innovation there. Now, our moderator for this session is Ambassador Richard Morningstar, who is a founder of the Atlantic Council. He and I have spoken on a number of occasions. So Richard, I'd like to hand over to you. If you could introduce your panelists, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. Just one quick correction. I would like to have been the founder of the Atlantic Council. What I am is founder of the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, and I'm the founding chairman of that. First of all, I guess I should mention, we obviously have an elephant in the room this morning, which is the U.S. election. And I'm a little bit bleary-eyed, and I apologize if I'm incoherent at times, given being up a good part of the night watching election returns. It's still very much uncertain. I think there's a very good chance that Biden will still win the election, but the Senate looks like it will probably stay Republican. I would like to, before going any further, introduce our panel. I noticed that my picture is not on the screen. I hope that you are. I hope that you're hearing me in any event. But the panel includes Aziz Kassim, Vice President for Development in the Middle East for Excelerate Energy, who are very much in the floating LNG business. Don Victory, who is Upstream Chief Process Engineer for ExxonMobil Integrated Solutions, and Patricia Tiller, who's a partner in Hunton Andrews Kurth, the law firm. So really looking forward to this discussion in which the panelists will explore the role of floating LNG storage and regasification units, LNG to power projects, small-scale gas-fired plants, which are talked about a lot as possibilities, including in places like the Balkans, carbon capture, utilization and storage, hydrogen blending, bunkering, other uses for floating LNG, bunkering, road transport, and the like. So given that we're limited in time, I would like to go directly to Aziz and ask you this question. We're in a very difficult period, as we all know, because of the pandemic, low gas prices, drop in demand in many places. And given that, could you outline how you see the future of floating storage and regasification units? Where do you think they're most likely to flourish? What types of terminals? What are challenges? How will cost issues be dealt with? Basically, how do you see the future?
Thank you, Ambassador Richard. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening for those who are joining us from the Far East. First, I want to thank Petroleum Economists for organizing this virtual event on behalf of Excelerate. It's my honor to be here with you guys, and I would like to thank my colleagues in this panel, as well as Ambassador Richard. First, what is a floating regas terminal? It's basically it's just an LNG carrier with topside equipments in the top that has it be able to regasify and send high pressure natural gas. Excelerate has been introducing this technology since 2003 when it was founded back in 2003, and in 2005 when we started the LNG import terminals in the Gulf of Mexico before the shale gas development basically came up in 2005. We see the floating regas terminal, there is a huge demand for the floating regas terminals for many different reasons, for the development costs and as well as for the technology they can provide and enable a lot of the countries to start quickly to import LNG and take advantage of the lower prices. With the abundance of the LNG around the world that we have seen in many different regions, especially with the US coming up with a lot of LNG and of course Australia and Qatar, we've seen a lot of these countries. In the past, it was very difficult for them to even think about importing LNG, I would say. But with the floating regas terminals, especially in the FSRU side, and with Excelerate was the first, I would say, the leader came up and tried to introduce the whole concept of the whole integrated solution. We make it so much easier for a lot of these countries in terms of how can they take advantage of the LNG. The best example for that is basically Bangladesh and Pakistan. And when we came up to these countries, I remember I was still involved for these countries from the beginning. It's been almost, I would say, 10 years when they start looking into this. But once they found out this is the best solution, when Excelerate came up and tried to find the whole integrated solution for them, it was so much easier, and they came up with the second project within a year, I would say. So just to give you an idea of different type of mooring solution that has been introduced, where we have done about 13 terminals around the world. These 13 terminals that we have developed, some of them we call them a gas port, and the other one is called a gateway, which is a floating gateway. You didn't need, I would say, a jetty or just an offshore instead of a dockside solution. Each one of them fit really well, depending on the geography of the country, and the ocean conditions largely dictate which solution that we need for the right choice for the project. A gas port itself or dockside regasification configuration, either at the near or depending on the environment, as I mentioned earlier, and also the installation time for these depend on what we have already in place. If there's an existing solution, if there's an existing infrastructure itself, it takes between 9 to 12 months, depending. Sometime we actually did it within 5 to 6 months, like what we have done in Argentina and in Bahia Blanca. But of course, there's always challenges. The offshore solution, it always depending on what's already been exist, but you always have to think about the subsea pipeline, but it could take between 12 to 18 months. Some of the challenges that we seen back towards the financing, but a lot of the institutions and the banks and IFC and a lot of these companies who understand the financing side, they understand the concept, and they can mitigate the risk. So we see this becomes an easier depending on the partner. But also we need to, sometime whenever we go to different countries, we always face a lot of the obvious. We have to introduce what is LNG, how does it work, and how can they make sure it's sustainable, how can they make sure there is gas, continue to provide gas to the power plant. And that's when we see some of the challenges for a lot of these countries. They try and say, okay, how can I make sure that we have gas continuous, is not going to stop, or what is the storage capacity in each one of these. So but we overcome a lot of these obstacles, and during the pandemic, especially in 2020, we made sure the gas is flowing flawlessly without any issues from that side. I hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you, Aziz. Let me just ask you then one follow-up question on the pandemic and on commercial conditions as a result of that with respect to gas right now. And you spoke briefly about cost. Has the pandemic and resulting effects in the marketplace had any significant effect on your business, or are you, do you think, in a better situation because of having more flexibility, lower costs, et cetera?
Good question. I would not say it didn't affect. I mean, yes, we did face a lot of challenges. Be honest, especially from the crew changes on board the ship. In the beginning, some of them have to stay a little bit longer, but actually our senior management and our CEO and basically decided to go ahead, and we actually had to charter sometime a private jet just to make sure that because there is no flight in between these different countries where we have to bring the crew on board these ships. But the senior management of Excelerate made sure that they want to make sure that everyone is happy in port. And so we really had to charter private jets to go to some of the countries that there was no commercial flights for the crew to change. And yes, we incur some cost. We face some challenges, but we made sure that there's no interruption in the service. That's the most important, I would say, and making sure everyone is happy in port.
And it has not affected your, excuse me, not affected your future investment plans?
Absolutely. Actually, once our existing customer, when they see that we are committed, and they see, yes, we are committed, and we have done, we took all the steps, and this is the quality of services that we provided, they actually, we made sure that going forward that we have, a backup to our future plans, of course, but it does not affect our future plans in terms of the investment for specific projects. It's actually the opposite. We made sure that we go aggressively, and this is the type of project that we're looking to increase going forward.
Okay, thank you, Aziz. Before going to Patricia, let me remind the audience that if you have questions, just put them in the chat room, and I will try to monitor them after we go through one or two rounds with our panelists. So let me go to you, Patricia. Being a lawyer, being involved in the financing aspects, the legal aspects, the regulatory aspects, you must see a lot of challenges. And so I would ask you, where do you see the challenges in the project finance area, in the regulatory area, even from a policy standpoint in places in the world that aren't convinced that gas has to be a necessary part of the transition, which I think we would all agree is not the case. But if you could give some comments in those areas.
Good question. So if I can start with financing, I mean, traditionally LNG projects have been financed on the back of long-term sale and purchase agreements. that is slowly changing, even for the mega LNG projects, only because the LNG sale and purchase market itself is changing. It's no longer, 20-year contracts as the norm. These days, we see a lot of 10-year, 15-year contracts. Particularly for small-scale LNG, that length of contract is just not possible. Small-scale LNG and FSRU to a power plant, for instance, the business model is largely untested. Some of the technology is untested. It is very unlikely that project participants and off-takers are going to be willing to enter into that length of term contract for a model that doesn't have, a proper market test. So financiers are going to have to change what they are expecting in terms of security for those projects. And this limited recourse model that has become very, very common is potentially not going to be the way forward. There's actually a whole other session later today on financing with my colleague Jim Simpson, who's moderating it. So I'm sure there will be a very interesting discussion on those things. As to your other questions, legal aspects on the project, one of the big questions is always, risk allocation across the project spectrum. So, for instance, aligning risks under the LNG sale and purchase agreements with the risks under the FSRU time charter party, if it's an FSRU, and then also aligning those risks downstream with the off-taker, whether it's an off-taker just for natural gas or whether or not gas is being sold directly to an independent power producer, and there are then, end users with electricity contracts, and aligning the of LNG with the the output that is needed for the end users under the power purchase agreement. That's a big risk for project participants. One way that projects have managed that is to create an SPV where all of the project participants are owners in that SPV and they therefore share in that risk. That sort of model is again becoming less attractive in the current climate, and participants are more inclined to now want to limit risk to their own sector, so that the FSRU owner, for instance, is not interested in becoming a part equity owner in a larger SPV that needs to take risk in failure to deliver under LNG supply contracts and failure to supply electricity. From the regulatory side, one of the big issues that we're seeing is that these types of projects, particularly when we're now looking at small scale LNG projects, which are becoming very popular, these types of projects are now happening a lot in emerging markets where previously they have not imported LNG, and therefore they do not have any sort of regulatory framework for importing LNG. All they have is a government authority, usually a single government authority, who is responsible for providing power to the masses. And that same authority is usually the only one who is allowed to purchase in fuel to create that power. And with small scale LNG, you're now seeing new players wanting to purchase fuel, and they want to purchase LNG, which has never happened before. And so one of the reasons that some of the recent projects have failed is that the countries have not quickly enough developed a regulatory, a technical, a legal framework to support importing LNG, regasifying it, and then selling to the grid, but by potentially more than one power producer. And if you don't have a regulatory framework set up from project inception, you cannot control project costs, because your contractors are essentially guessing as to what their risk will be in that market. They need to know when they're going in, when they're bidding on that contract, exactly what they can and can't do, and who they need to report to and who they need to get permits from, and how long those permits take and how much those permits cost, and what are the fines if there is some environmental breach. And if those rules essentially are not in place at the outset of the project, then you have massive cost overruns, and a lot of these projects have just not got off the ground in the first place. So those, I guess, are the big issues from a legal point of view.
Those are what you said are, to me, your answers have been very fascinating, and in fact, I think present some conundrums that are maybe difficult to solve. I mean, it's clear to me from listening to Aziz and you that small-scale LNG projects through floating terminals are definitely a way for the future. But the last points you made on developing countries' ability to carry through on these projects raises the question as to how valuable would development assistance be from international development agencies, whether it be from the EU or member states or from AID or whatever, and how critical might that be? And then the other question is, I can see how financing a small-scale LNG project and a gas-to-power project using a floating terminal would be difficult from a project finance standpoint for the reasons that you mentioned. That, hey, who's going to buy the gas? Do you have an airtight contract? How long-term is it going to be, and so forth. And so that also raises the question as to how important international financial agencies or institutions need to be in financing these kinds of projects. Even in the US with our new Development Finance Corporation, they very possibly could get involved in these projects. So how important do you think government guarantees are going to be to carry through on many of the projects that I think you and Aziz, and I'm sure Don would think would be very valuable?
I think they're vital, so for instance, Hunton Andrews Kurth is working on the Mozambique LNG export project at the moment, which is being financed by World Bank. And as a result, we are ensuring that the country has the appropriate legal framework and understanding of the contractual matrix that it is entering into from the outset. Without World Bank being there, essentially guiding the project, you would have exactly the problems that I've talked about, where the regulatory system lags behind the stage that the project needs to be at in order to achieve the scheduled commercial operation date. Excelerate did a similar thing in Bangladesh. IFC was involved there, and they were, again, to a certain extent, guiding the project and making sure that the legal framework was in place. Bangladesh, had never imported LNG before, and Accelerate's done a wonderful job there, making that project a success. But yes, with the support of an external credit agency and political risk insurance and government guarantees and all of the things that you're talking about.
Good. Well, thank you. And last but not least, we go to Don, Don Victory. And Don, you're a technologist. I think you're the one real technologist on the panel. And I can tell you, I am, if you look at things like my mechanical aptitude and the like, I am the furthest thing from a technologist. Maybe you could do a couple of things for us. One is to comment, any comments you wanted to make on what has already been said, and where you see the future in these kinds of projects, but also what, from a technology standpoint, you and your company and others are doing to meet some of the policy issues and concerns about the environmental footprint of natural gas. Are there the same issues with respect to floating terminals, things like methane emissions, carbon capture and the like? what's being done in those areas and how important are those technical areas, without getting too much into the technology, to make for LNG to continue to be an accepted project, or an accepted fuel in all parts of the world, and as I think we would agree, a necessary part of the energy transition.
Okay, so you gave me a lot there. I'll start with the small scale LNG because I want to do that, and then I'll go to the question about de-intensifying the carbon footprint in the LNG value chain. So just extending what Patricia was talking about, and Patricia and Aziz were mostly talking about small scale LNG, which are probably talking parcel size in a small ship range, maybe 10,000 to 50,000 cubic meters. If you look at what Kogas did in Korea with the break bulk, where they're going to Jeju Island, they have 45,000 cubic meter tankers, so about a third of world scale ocean tankers. There's another exciting opportunity, and that's what I call micro LNG. And especially for developing countries like Africa, in Africa or India, and there's some fairly established models. If you look at LNG is being taken in ISO containers and has been for about 7 or 8 years from Lisbon to Madeira Island in a virtual pipeline system to power a 50 megawatt power plant. So you have truckable containers that are going first on top of a ship to Madeira Island, down the road to the power plant, and providing that power. So in terms of development assistance, which you brought up, Richard, and trying to raise the rising middle class in various parts around the world, including Africa and India, that's a fairly established model. We've seen trucking in China at a large scale. We see it in India now developing, and I would predict somewhere down the road we'll probably see it in Africa. In terms of carbon intensity and getting ready for the future, we're seeing a lot of activity in Europe getting ready for potentially putting hydrogen into the gas systems. We're seeing a lot of pilot projects in the UK. We're seeing a lot of discussion going on in Germany about converting that system open. We're also seeing the manufacturers preparing. So the gas turbine manufacturers are able to convert from burning pure natural gas to accepting a modest blend of hydrogen without any substantial modifications, to changing out their burners within the gas turbine to maybe accept hydrogen levels of 20% plus. We're seeing that in places like Utah, where there's a project where they're going to do hydrogen storage in salt domes to take, to have the seasonality of hydrogen act as an energy storage device. We're seeing a plant in Ohio, and we're seeing the European gas turbine manufacturers getting ready, even performing test stands for gas compressors on pipeline systems, being able to accept 5, 10, 15, 20% hydrogen. So the market is getting ready. They are preparing the equipment, they're laying the plans. And so within that framework, LNG is arriving in Europe, and it will have to compete as an energy source on a number of attributes: cost, carbon intensity, and other type of attributes. If you look at some of the forecasts from Bloomberg NEF, you can see a range of when low carbon hydrogen might be available from LNG and competitive with hydrogen from electrolyzers that could be anywhere from 10 years to a couple decades. So the technology and the cost curve will probably continue to bend down for all technologies. There's a big debate going on when they will cross over. That's kind of like predicting the presidential election. You actually don't know the results until they come in. But I can see that gas arriving in Europe as LNG and being decarbonized with carbon sequestration is probably going to be competitive for a good while, and will be helping to bridge to the future or remain a long-term part of the answer, depending on how the technology develops, market shakes out, and regulatory policy winds up.
When you look at things down like the the Green Deal in Europe and possible carbon border adjustment mechanisms and the need to have objective and transparent data for them not to be discriminatory. Do you think at this point countries, should the US and Europe and maybe other countries be working with the private sector to develop standards and rules with respect to methane emissions, for example, or carbon, or carbon capture, or whatever?
Yes, and it's going on, and ExxonMobil is part of that. We're part of the methane initiative, and for example, so every part of the value chain needs to do its part in order to preserve room in the carbon budget. So certainly in the upstream in the US, we're using technologies like satellites and optical scanners to find where there may be leaks in the upstream system in order to plug those, make modifications. As that technology becomes more readily deployed, we should see other operators starting to use it and reducing that. So that's a big part of it. We're seeing a lot of activity in various marketplaces for various types of certificates that can be traced to the carbon intensity of a product. And we'll probably see lots of competition there where people will compete on the transparency of the carbon intensity of the product they're producing. So there's talk about CO2 border taxes. There's other needs for accounting. For example, when you look at the 45Q tax credit in the United States for putting carbon in the ground. So the regulatory support is starting to form. The push for transparency and the use of technology in order to make that happen, both technology such as scanning, but also digital technology in order to provide virtual tickets to track the carbon intensity of the product as it moves through the value chain.
And I guess satellite imagery is going to become important.
Absolutely, it already is important. It's finding where there are significant methane emitters around the world, and people are getting to work getting after it. So that is certainly part of the suite of technology.
Right. Thank you, Don. That's great. I noticed that there are no questions in the chat room. I don't know whether that's because people are shy or hungover from watching US election results or whatever. But I have some more questions myself since I don't see any. I do have. We do have a couple of questions. But first, let me ask the other panelists if they have. Do you have any comments on anything that any of you have said so far that you would like to add, or should we go directly to more questions? Hearing none.
Questions. I have a question for Dawn and a question for Aziz. Dawn, we've got a lot of clients coming to us at the moment, smaller players with proposing off-the-shelf, prefabricated storage tanks and compressors. Is there really such a thing as a one-size-fits-most, LNG storage tank for projects, or will we really need to stick to the current way the industry does business, which is really bespoke designs for each project?
And that's for me or Aziz?
Well, I thought you would be best placed.
Yeah.
Aziz can answer if he wants.
A completely off-the-shelf design, no, but a off-the-shelf components that are put together for site-specific solutions that take advantage of the cost economies of manufacturing, yes, that is happening. I mean, if you have a 10,000-gallon tank, you really don't need to do a bespoke design. But we're even actually seeing that in the LNG production space, that we're seeing large production facilities being put together by repeating manufacturing units. So historically, the LNG industry has used a very effective cost reduction strategy of economy of scale, but economy of manufacturing is also very powerful. So the more that you could take standard components, and I'll throw it over to Aziz, but there's no reason for him to go redesign a regasifier that he might put on an FSRU every time, when there are a couple standard sizes that the manufacturers have off the shelf. So if you want to reduce your schedule, it's probably better to go get 2 or 3 that the manufacturer is already coming down their production line than taking the time to go do a bespoke design. So So common components maybe put together uniquely is probably the ticket.
Yeah, I would add, I agree with you, Dan. I think it's going to be difficult to have one common standard. However, I would say as we go, as the market become liquid and more of these countries start to I would say, adapt the FSRU floating regas terminals. And also as we go and see the LNG bunkering, I would say this is where we're going to have to start to see a lot of these LNG bunkering has to be standardized to be able to make a lot of the, I would say, the industry take advantage of that, make it easier for them. But in terms of each country is different, as I mentioned. Each location is different. We still have to make sure it's custom designed for that specific country. And we have seen what we have done in a lot of these countries. You mentioned Bangladesh. We have to go, we have to make sure everything from tugboats all the way to connection point. The same thing when we did here in Dubai, where I'm located, where we have to go and redesign the whole existing FSRU and revamp and increase the send out capacity. So which is different than the standard FSRU that we have in place.
Okay, folks, we only have left about 5 minutes, and I have two questions from the audience and 2 questions of my own, which maybe I'll ask all together and get maybe your comments on them and any closing comments you'd like to make. One is it's apparently a hydrogen cynic in the audience, and I'm not sure if these 2 questions are from the same. It's from the same person, but one comment being, well, what's the big deal about hydrogen? It may reduce specific CO2 emissions only by 6%, and that there could be negative consequences, as well as in Europe, that we're moving to prevent hydrogen from being produced from natural gas, which I personally think would be a big mistake. But in any event, there's that question and excluding it from the market. So maybe Don on that when I turn it back to you guys or any of the others. The other questions I had and this would be Aziz and Patricia, and that is other uses or new uses for LNG. You mentioned bunkering, Aziz, transport. How do you see that in the future? And do you see these floating terminals as moving? Could you have, for example, off the coast of a country, 5 small power plants or availability of putting it in shipping or whatever, and then moving the facility down the coast to other countries? And the risks that involves from pirates or terrorists or whatever, which is maybe a Patricia issue. So I think, why don't we go into some of those things for the last couple of minutes? Don, if you want to start on hydrogen, and then any comments from the others, and Aziz and Patricia to some of the questions that I just raised.
Yeah, my point on hydrogen was one more of building knowledge in order to build industry capability as opposed to trying to predict an endpoint. So for example, the comment in the chat room is, well, if you put 20% volume in the pipeline, that might only be about 6% on a BTU basis, reducing CO2 emissions. But if you're living on a budget, 6% matters. And if you're building capability, most people don't realize that, the United States has a very large scale hydrogen pipeline system that runs 1,000 kilometers plus along the US Gulf Coast, supplying industrial customers. Those type of capabilities can build over time and compound to where you're starting to unlock future opportunities. So we're on a path of discovery and journey, and we have to take advantage of all the learning opportunities that fit with the commercial opportunities and the regulatory framework that's available in order to build our future. So it's more of a pathway I was describing than trying to predict an endpoint.
Good, thanks, Don. Okay, let's go to Aziz and Patricia with respect to the other questions. Don, obviously, you can jump in if you'd like. Again, we only have 2 or 3 minutes. I don't know whether they're going to shut us off at exactly 40 minutes past the hour. But so Aziz, maybe if you wanted to start, and if Patricia wanted to add any comments.
Sure. I mean, You mentioned, yes, there's other usage. I would say the LNG bunkering and ISO container, it has been mentioned before in many, we do see a lot of that could take advantage, and also LNG trucking. That could be another business that when it comes to when the FSRU comes to play, the more we have in place. But in terms of, I would say power, floating power, as far as Excelerate, we haven't developed such thing. And as you can see, there is all of that involve a lot of the insurance, technicality, also the LNG storage. It starts to become more complicated, and I would say I would say we haven't, as Excelerate, we haven't done one yet. I know it has been done around the world, and there is already, but they haven't been running by, I would say, LNG. There's one small, what is a company has already started who have done one in Indonesia, but it's in terms of the storage of the LNG, it's very, very small. I would leave that to Don, who is familiar with the whole technology from that perspective.
Okay,
But Patricia, feel free to
I've been informed that we have less than 1 minute left. So Patricia, any final comments by you? And then I think we're going to have to regretfully close off. We could go on for a long time if we had the time.
Just on your comment of, moving the FSRU, I guess. I mean, logistically, there's no reason that you couldn't do that. An FSRU is at its heart a vessel. It can service one project in the summer and then move up the coast and service an industrial user in the winter. So logistically, that's certainly possible. From a legal point of view, there's obviously a myriad of issues. What if something happens to it in the summer and then it's not available during the winter? Whose fault is it? Who bears the liability? So I guess that's the problem with servicing more than one project, even though something like an FSRU or an FSRP or an FSU can technically move, all over the place. I'll stop there.
Okay, that's terrific. The panel, you've all been great. I wish we had a lot more time because there would be a lot more to discuss. But I think the powers that be are telling me that our time is up. So thank you, and I hope our paths will cross again. And great job by the panel. Thanks very much.